So for anyone who's from Jammu and Kashmir, Anuradha Bhasin probably doesn't need an introduction, but for those of you who don't know who she is a native of Jammu. She's also the executive director of the iconic newspaper, the Kashmir Times, which was founded in 1954. And amongst her achievements, she held a Commonwealth Fellowship in 2016, a John S. Knight Fellow at Stanford University between 2022 and 2023. And she's also the author of a book that's published by Harper-Collins titled A Dismantled State, The Untold Story of Kashmir After Article 370. And I'm Dr. Sarina Hussain. I'm an Associate Professor of Sociology at the Centre for Peace and Security, Adjunct Professor of Politics at Quaid-e-Azam University, and a non-resident scholar at the Institute for Regional Studies. So Anuradha, as I said, you're a native of Jammu and you've worked extensively on the Kashmir Valley. You've also visited Azad Kashmir, and I think that puts you in quite a unique position in the sense that you have what I would consider quite a holistic understanding of the entire state. I just wanted your perspective on the recent events of the last 2 weeks, perhaps further back if you wanted to take us back further.
Thank you. First of all, I would say when you say holistic understanding of Jammu and Kashmir, I must add and confess that I've been looking at Kashmir from a distance for the last 2 years. I haven't been to Kashmir since 2022 on the Indian side, and on the Pakistani side, I think my last visit was 2013. So that's a long time ago. But I did meet a cross section of people there. Now about the what has happened recently, of course, has added to the anxieties of the people. And while there is a new confrontation opening up between India and Pakistan, and where, all hostilities and wars are actually played on the bodies of people living in the borders, particularly the people of Jammu and Kashmir on both sides of the line of control and the borders. And that's something that has been ongoing for the last 70 years. The last 2 decades were there was a relative calm with few years of, between 2012 and 2020. There were incidents of hostilities and ceasefire violations, but, there had been some comparative calm. And this has really deepened the anxieties of the people, their sense of insecurity, and their imperative need to find a lasting solution and for everlasting peace, a sustainable peace. And I think it's also rooted not just in India, Pakistan, relationships which have not been easy in the last 70 years, barring few periods of good and sustained diplomacy, but also lingering Kashmir conflict, which is intrinsically, interlinked to the India-Pakistan dispute.
I wanted to ask you, Anuradha, of course, for people who are from both sides of the line of control, that's the dividing line that often referred to also as the ceasefire line, which divides Pakistan-administered and Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir. They experience fairly frequent cross-border firing and ceasefire violations, but the war, and I'm choosing to call it a war, the recent war that we saw 2 weeks or so ago, really escalated to a new height, didn't it, for the people living on the border in Jammu and Kashmir, in the sense that on the Pakistani side, or what we commonly refer to as Azad Kashmir, we were completely shocked because there were missile strikes into 2 of our cities. So these weren't just the sort of the peripheral borders, but the actual cities where residents are living, in Kotli and in Muzaffarabad. And for those of us who are from the diaspora, you know, Kotli was very close to home for us, and I think that was a real shock. It was something completely unexpected. I know that you yourself are from Jammu, and Jammu also on the Indian administered side was hit. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that and what that was like for people on the ground? I know you weren't there in person, but I do know that you had family there at the time.
Yeah, extremely shocking. You know, the last major war we ever had, I don't know whether to call it a war. It is a 3 day, it was almost like a war. And probably worse than the last confrontation we had in 1999, the Kargil War, which wasn't just limited to Kargil, but there were fronts opened all along the line of control. With the heaviest ever, at least on the Indian side, that period saw the heaviest ever land mining operations, which again, the landmines that lay buried along the LOC on both sides, both as a policy, neither Pakistan nor India demine their areas. They also claim many civilian victims over a period of years. And before that, I think the major wars we had were, the last one was 71. And 71 was a different period in this world. In these 3 days, we've just seen a trailer of modern warfare, what it is, what it looks like. You know, military technologies have changed. We've entered an era of AI and digitalization and, a lot of sophistication in the air battles, on kinetic battles. And that is extremely shocking because missiles and shelling and firing, that's been happening earlier, but not on this scale. While even at the borders, like people in Punch, for instance, that's the most vulnerable on the Indian side, because it's like a little bowl-shaped valley where Pakistan has an advantage because, Pakistani armies are sitting atop the hill, whereas the valley is down below, and they have a clear advantage. And they've been used to it while they work in their fields, while they're sleeping at night. But it's never been this scale that houses, people, many people, in fact, suspecting that this would happen in the days prior to the strikes, had already abandoned the villages, but many of them were still there, and which is why the casualties were very high and painfully high. You had these very shocking, if you may have seen those 12-year-old twins who died, and 16 people gone in just one day of firing. Houses have been turned into rubble and just dust. And on this scale, it's never happened in post 71. So the recent memory of people and this new generation hasn't seen this kind of a warfare. And much worse, I mean, usually cities like Jammu, Srinagar, Udhampur, which is even further, towards the east, they've never experienced this kind of a shelling. And so that came as a shock. It was scary. It was frightening. Constantly through 3 to 4 days, living with sirens, blackouts, and mysterious bombings in the air. Nobody knew what was happening and what would happen next, and there were targets. In Jammu city, there were houses that were damaged. Missiles landed there. And I remember constantly, it was like without being there, I was kind of dragged into that place. I had friends in Kashmir Valley, in Jammu, my own family, my daughter was there. And so, the whole night as they stayed up, we were communicating somehow, but it was extremely, the panic-stricken calls, being stuck there with friends saying, okay, this may be the end, we'll never see the light of the another day. And yeah, even to recall those moments is extremely painful.
There was firing on the Pakistani side before, of course, the retaliation strikes, I suppose we can call them. How did people perceive that on the ground on the Indian side of Jammu and Kashmir? Because they must have, of course, also heard the news that there were these strikes. I know that there had been some announcements warning that it was going to happen, but I think it was still a shock. I think for the people who were living certainly in Azad Kashmir
Uh,
and in Pakistan.
Yeah, initially some were a little surprised, some were apprehending. One was apprehensive, particularly, in 2019 after the Pulwama bombings in which the CRPF, 40 CRPF men were killed. Within days, the Modi government had gone ahead with these strikes saying, we will enter the house and we will attack them. And so one did expect and anticipate this. But this happened after a bit of a gap, more than 2 weeks after the Pahalgam killings, which are the trigger of the present escalation, where 26 people, including, mostly tourists, and killed out, singled out because of their religion. Well, I'll come back to locally how people see this, but about anticipating it, I think many people felt, okay, this may not happen this time because, the Modi government had announced the suspension of the IWT and Pakistan threatened, to back out of the Simla agreement. The diplomatic missions were being thinned down and trimmed, and diplomats were being sent back. And one thought maybe this is better off than a full-scale escalation, and it may not happen. And then Modi did a surprise thing, and surprisingly, and probably most irresponsible, that a day before kind of announcing, oh, we're going to go in for big civil defense training and all of that, and there's preparedness on both sides. You can understand and you can sense that. And doing a whole tamasha as he usually does about how they're going to do a civil defense training, and then he left these very civilians unprotected and went ahead with the strikes. I mean, any layman would understand, at least people in Jammu and Kashmir know, that if India would strike on the other side, whether it's military targets or non-military, as the Indian government kept framing it, and Pakistan would retaliate. That's been our history. Neither of them knows restraint, and they are going to retaliate. So when it happened, I think there were fears and anxiety in most of Jammu and Kashmir, and particularly in the border areas. At that time, probably somebody sitting in Srinagar must have thought, "Oh, we are safe," or somebody sitting in Jammu. In fact, people in Jammu, in the last 15 years, they're they've become more and more right wing in their thinking. And for them, Modi, a larger chunk of the population, not all, but a large chunk of the population is a big, they're ardent supporters of Modi and his ideology, and they have full faith, okay, he's the one who's going to probably end up flattening Pakistan. And that's what they believed, and that's what the Indian media was telling them. Kashmir media has already been silenced, so there was no truth actually coming out. So people in Jammu, while they were celebrating for a while, and then they realized, okay, it just backfired. And Jammu was one of the worst affected cities, out of the big cities. Um, so that was it. And as far as the strike, the Operation Sindoor, I mean, to me, a very repulsive word because it's extremely patriarchal. But Operation Sindoor was a bit questionable because here in the Pahalgam attack, indeed, very shocking, very painful, very tragic. And even for Kashmiris who've never come out in big numbers and condemned. I mean, they've never condoned civilian killings, but this was a time, when they were shocked because it is against the Kashmiri ethos to especially, kill guests. Tourists are seen as guests and singled out on basis of their religion. But there were questions, because within hours of the attack, India declared that there was a Pakistani hand in this. Of course, it's very tempting to go back to blame Pakistan because in the past, in many terror attacks, there has been a Pakistan hand. One could, but this was mainly based on assumption, unlike the Mumbai terror attacks, where there was India prepared a very watertight case, investigated the whole thing, and then found there was ample evidence against Pakistan and placed it before that. And then, all the blame went to kind of Pakistan for not cooperating with the investigation and taking action against the culprits that had been named. In this case, no investigation came through. So they went ahead with the attack merely on basis of suspicion, which may or may not be true. But it doesn't make a very credible case of attacking. And so these were questions on the minds of the people. Here are 26 people killed. Okay, yes, we are very shocked and we are very pained. But is it wise to merely, on the basis of suspicion, just go about attacking the other side and risking more people instead? And we have fatalities on both sides, not just on the the Operation Sindoor strikes, which we don't know who was killed and who wasn't killed. Were the civilians? Were there some civilians and some militant outfit people? We really don't have those figures. But in those 3 or 4 days of strikes across the exchange of fire across the borders, and then the drone fighting, civilians have been the casualties on both sides.
So there was an inevitability that there would be some casualties on the Indian administered side of Jammu and Kashmir. I mean, was there a preparedness? Because I know on the Pakistan administered side of Kashmir, there was some criticism to say, well, there weren't announcements made. People should have been told to leave, that these were being anticipated. I suppose on the Indian side, given that India had planned the strikes on Pakistan and anticipated retaliation, was there any support that was given to people, like to help move them out of their localities? Or
no, that's why I said, like Modi sprung a surprise. One day his government is talking about civil defense training. Okay, so people say, okay, maybe, if something is happening after that. And a day before that, they were to start that so-called civil defense training. They started the strikes. But even before that, I think low-key cross-firing had already started. At least in Uri, that was experienced. People talked about it. We remember doing a story just days before these strikes that had already started. So people were worried. They were anticipating that things will change. There are people who've experienced prolonged wars, or I mean, you can't call it war all the time, but even non-war periods have never been very stable. It's always constantly living in the line of fire. And they'd already started preparing, stocking, Some of them were living there in Punch. Now I hear people started vacating 3, 4 days before all these strikes happened, but not all of them. You know, not many people can move out. Some people have relatives in safer areas, so they move out. These are very poor people. They cannot afford to leave unless the situation is really, really dire, and think of living somewhere else on rent or maybe even shelterless.
And even just in terms of transportation, even once the
Everything.
strikes had started, there was nothing provided for local people.
Nothing at all. In fact, the story we did we reported about the Uri, and a bit of firing where it had started, and people were talking about they were preparing, some of them had bunkers in their houses, and they had started cleaning them up and, stocking their things there. Many others didn't have, and their demand was make bunkers for us. Things are going to be harder for us. And these were their concerns and fears, which actually turned out to be true.
One of the other things that I wanted to ask you about, of course, was the media at the time. I mean, it was a media frenzy. I know you work in journalism, so you probably have a better understanding of the terminology, but certainly for me as an onlooker, I mean, there was a bombardment of content, and some of it was, of course, we now know not true, just simply, what we would think.
Yeah, sometimes people do, at least in that immediate moment, they start questioning, oh, is this true? But if I could, I would tell people, for their own sanity and for being better informed, one shouldn't rely on the television channels, especially in India. I don't find many good channels, even in Pakistan. They also get carried away by the state narrative. But the Indian media was extremely repulsive. And of course, we have some very good, vibrant media, but that's not what is now known as mainstream media, that merely exists in the digital space, most of it. And they did some fantastic work. But the television media, which is dominating, and even the print media, most of it, they were churning out lies. And yeah, you're right, the war hysteria, and the war hysteria was also, there were bloodletting cries, not just on television media, but also on social media. And I think this is a lot to do with a right-wing government in India, which Hindu right-wing government, which sees Muslims as the biggest enemy, and where lines between the Muslim and terrorists and Pakistan, they get completely blurred. And then they see them all as that, but at the same time, they were conscious to, put up an image of a united India, and in which they did with the kind of narrative, the official narrative that they were trying to peddle through two officers, women officers of, that was kind of an optics that they were creating. There was one, a Muslim officer, and another one, and both are women. So they're trying to project India as very feminist, as very, very secular, and though that was not really in sync with the ground reality of what was happening on a daily basis with Muslims in India. And in the last 10 years, they whipped up so much hatred against Muslims. And that easily becomes, because when you blur the lines between the Muslims and the terrorists and Pakistan, they are all seen as one singular enemy. It was so easy to whip up that war hysteria, and this right wing narratives are also about supremacism. And Modi has kind of built up this image, and this is all created fake image of him as, as a person of some bravado, as some kind of a superman. And people actually, it's like the South Asia is a land of superstitions. You have these fake godmen and peers and all of that, and you have extreme faith, how people, unknowingly believe in that. And he's become a cult figure like that. So people actually believed, okay, he's saying we're going to flatten Pakistan, and there's a lot of rejoicing, and they actually believe it. And Which I think is stupidity even in terms of warfare. I mean, when do you go to war? Purely assessing your own military power, and which is good and which is ready and which is prepared and all of that, but without assessing the enemy, the military power of the other side. Um, I, I mean, for any person who is militarily sound, they might find this logic of going ahead with war without assessing the abilities and the limitations of the other side.
And then, of course, a ceasefire was announced, and that kind of dampened that, I suppose. But then how was that reported? Because it was almost like a complete sort of shift. And it
Yeah.
happened very quickly, didn't it? Because we heard that there'd been a ceasefire agreement.
Yeah, I mean, in Kashmir, across Jammu and Kashmir, of course, and by then I think probably people in Jammu were also thinking differently. It brought an immense sense of relief. But there was some caution, and because that same day, within hours of the ceasefire, there was some violation from the other side. And interestingly, India saying, okay, no, 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 this is not a ceasefire violation, this is something else. But that day, I mean, it was unprecedented. Just for about 45 minutes, there were these, drone attacks or bombings, mysterious ones, even in Udhampur, a place like Udhampur, which hadn't been attacked in the previous 3 days. Yeah, while one needs to kind of analyze why that happened, was it just a lack of communication on the ground, which I don't think, or was it adventurism from the Pakistan side, or was it some kind of a messaging? But for India, I think the moment was extremely embarrassing because, they had taken up a very anti-Pakistan position, and whereas Pakistan was completely backed by its ally China, India, which has invested a great deal in building up relationships with the US, here was their ally, announcing, and then of course Trump is a different person. And he announced, I mean, unlike the usual American position of being behind the scenes, but kind of, getting two sides to enter into a ceasefire and give them the credit for it. Of course, the here was America taking the credit for the ceasefire and announcing it even before India and Pakistan could have announced it. So that was probably egg on the face of the Modi government, which didn't want to be seen as somebody succumbing to Pakistan pressure or international pressure, and they tried to reframe it as, no, this has been worked out between India and Pakistan at the DGMO level. Now, these big decisions are not taken at that level. I think everybody knows. Whether some other back channel at a higher level was working, we don't know. And it hasn't been, claimed by either Pakistan or India. So I think this, even the whole messaging by the media, again, it started resorting to lies. Saying, okay, the ceasefire has been announced by us because we were winning the war and we've already threatened them and they are scared. And then it didn't even make much sense because why would a winning party ever call for a ceasefire? It should be, somebody who's threatened. But this was definitely a ceasefire brokered by the West, and it came from there. It came as more like a diktat, which India and Pakistan were compelled to follow.
Mm.
And I think that was embarrassing for Modi agreed deal. So the Indian media tried to cover up that embarrassment by again and again talking about how we have managed a victory against Pakistan. And Modi followed it up with his speech, which is again, it doesn't talk about, it's not the language of ceasefire, it's not the language of pacifism, but it's the language of renewed threat
Mm.
again saying that every act of terrorism, and which means, and which is extremely worrying and of concern, that any act of terrorism, I mean, even before we can investigate or have evidence against it, we are
Mm.
going to deem it as an act of war against Pakistan. I think that is extremely problematic, and that is extremely worrying because we've just seen what a war, modern war between India and Pakistan can be like. Two nations that are nuclear nations. Two nations that have not gone along well ever since they were born out of one existence, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just in terms of final thoughts, Anuradha, I mean, of course, this has put a spotlight back onto the issue of Kashmir and the Kashmir conflict. In terms of people from Jammu and Kashmir, do you think there's any space for us or any way that we can also weigh into some kind of reconciliation or at least de-escalation of this happening again anytime soon?
Definitely, I think people of Jammu and Kashmir on both sides of the line of control have the biggest interest in peace in the region. And I feel overall, and I'm not just talking about India, Pakistan, because it's not just India, Pakistan that get impacted by the
Mm.
hostility. Now we've seen the whole globe can be impacted, but largely the South Asian nations. I think because, and in none of these, we see any kind of statesman-like visionary leadership. And I think it is time for the civil society, for people, for people to people interactions to begin on a large scale, so that we can be heard, so that the voices of rationality, voices of peace, people who can understand why peace is important. I mean, it's not just important now, it's imperative. It is, if we continue like this, it is an existential threat for all of us. And we need to understand that, and understand the costs of war, which can be, I mean, for third world countries like India, Pakistan, and for the rest of South Asia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and all others. I think we need to focus on our other issues, our common agendas, hunger, education, climate change, all of these, I think, which are also kind of threatening our existence. So we need to move from war, from hostility, to building sustainable peace. And that cannot happen with just a top-down approach. It has to be a bottom-up approach.